Morgan Freeman went undercover at his own restaurant. What he discovered changed everything. Morgan Freeman had built his restaurant with a simple vision: good food, good service, and a workplace where employees thrived. But something was terribly wrong. Staff were quitting, complaints were piling up, and yet every report he received told him everything was fine. So he decided to see for himself. Does kindness define true leadership? Comment 1. Or is power all that matters? Comment 0. Morgan Freeman had seen enough. For weeks, he had watched his once thriving restaurant fall apart. The turnover rate had skyrocketed. Employees left without warning. And the energy, the warmth and excitement that once filled the space? Gone. Something was off. But every report from management, it told him the same thing. Everything is running smoothly, Mr. Freeman. He didn't believe it. So he decided to do what no one expected. That evening, Morgan dressed in plain clothes. No luxury suits, no fanfare. Just a simple man looking for a meal. When he walked through the doors of his own restaurant, no one looked twice. No one recognized him. No one treated him as the owner of the empire they worked for. And that was exactly what he wanted. Morgan sat at a corner table scanning the room. The servers moved with rushed, nervous energy. The bartender avoided eye contact. The customers seemed frustrated. Then his eyes landed on the manager, Carl, a towering, broad-shouldered man who spoke more with scowls than words. Morgan watched closely. Carl barked orders, ignored employees when they asked for help. And worst of all, he belittled one particular waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a smile that never quite reached her face. Her hands trembled when she served customers. And when she made a tiny mistake? Carl's voice boomed across the floor. "How hard is it to do your damn job right, Samantha?" Morgan set his coffee down slowly, because in that moment, he had seen enough. Morgan Freeman sat quietly in the dimly lit corner of his restaurant, a place he had once been so proud of. Yet something felt off. The atmosphere, once warm and welcoming, now seemed tense, strained. He watched as the waitstaff moved about, their smiles forced, their steps hurried. Something wasn't right. Employees had been quitting in droves. Turnover was higher than it had ever been, and no one, not a single person, could give him a straight answer as to why. Morgan had built this restaurant on respect, fairness, and passion. But now he needed to see the truth for himself. So he disguised himself. An old hoodie, jeans, nothing flashy, just another man looking for a warm meal. A simple customer in his own establishment. And what he was about to discover would change everything. A waitress approached his table, a young woman no older than her mid-20s. Her name tag read, Samantha. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she set a menu in front of him. "Welcome to Freeman's. Can I get you something to drink?" Morgan nodded. "Just a coffee, please." She scribbled down his order and turned away far too quickly, almost as if she was nervous. Morgan's gaze followed her as she moved behind the counter, where a tall, broad-shouldered man stood watching. The manager? Carl. His posture was rigid, authoritative, but there was something else there. Something cold. Morgan didn't miss the way Samantha flinched slightly when Carl walked past. Didn't miss the way her shoulders hunched as if bracing for something, and when Carl muttered something under his breath, his tone sharp and condescending, Morgan saw it. The flicker of fear in her eyes. This wasn't just stress. This was something much worse. A few moments later, Morgan heard it, a muffled sob from the kitchen. It was faint, but unmistakable. He turned his head, watching as Samantha hurriedly wiped her face before re-entering the dining area. But before she could fully step out, Carl stopped her. "Get it together," he hissed. "No one wants to see a crying waitress. You screw up again and you're gone." Morgan's grip tightened around his coffee cup. His stomach churned. This wasn't just bad management. This was abuse. Samantha nodded quickly, forcing a shaky smile before walking away. But Morgan saw it. The way her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the way her eyes darted around searching for an escape, the way every step seemed like she was carrying the weight of the world. Morgan had seen enough, and as he took a slow sip of his coffee, his decision became clear. Morgan leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He had built this restaurant from the ground up. He had always believed that a good business wasn't just about great food, but about the people who made it possible. And right now, his people were suffering because of one man, and that was about to change. Because if Carl thought he could get away with bullying his staff, he had no idea who he was dealing with. He had come here as a customer, but he was about to reveal himself as something much, much more. Morgan Freeman sat at his corner table watching every interaction, every unspoken exchange. It didn't take long to see that fear ran this place. Not teamwork, not respect, fear. The employees weren't working. They were surviving. Every move was calculated, every breath taken with caution. And at the center of it all, Carl. The manager stood with his arms crossed, scanning the floor like a predator watching its prey. And his next victim? Samantha. Morgan had just taken another sip of coffee when he heard it, the crash of shattering glass. The entire restaurant fell silent. Samantha stood frozen near a table, her hands trembling, a glass of water spilled across the floor. It had slipped from her grasp. A simple mistake. But Carl's reaction was anything but simple. His face turned red with fury. "Are you serious, Samantha?" he bellowed, stepping toward her. She opened her mouth, trying to apologize, but the words barely formed before Carl grabbed her by the wrist. "I'm done with your screw-ups. You want to cry in my kitchen? You want to embarrass this restaurant? Fine, you're fired." A gasp rippled through the dining area. Customers turned, whispering. Morgan set down his cup, his patience snapping like a brittle twig. Slowly, he pushed back his chair and stood. "Excuse me." Morgan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Carl turned, eyes narrowing. "Mind your business, old man." Morgan stepped forward, his presence suddenly impossible to ignore. "I think this is very much my business," he said calmly. Carl scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, yeah? And why's that?" Morgan reached into his pocket, pulling out his leather wallet. He retrieved a sleek black business card, then set it on the table with deliberate precision. Carl glanced at it, frowning, before his face drained of color. The name printed in gold lettering was unmistakable. Morgan Freeman, owner, Freeman's Fine Dining. A stunned silence fell over the restaurant. Samantha's eyes widened. The other employees looked at each other in disbelief. Carl opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling to form words. "Sir, I didn't realize—" Morgan cut him off with a raised hand. "Number you didn't." He turned his gaze to Samantha. "Are you okay?" Her lip quivered, but she nodded. "I am now." Morgan exhaled, then turned back to Carl, his voice laced with quiet authority. "You've made a terrible mistake today, Carl." Carl swallowed hard. "Sir, please, I was just trying to keep order." Morgan let out a slow, measured sigh. "No, Carl, you weren't keeping order. You were breaking people. And that's not how I run my business." Carl stammered, searching for an excuse, but Morgan had already made his decision. "Pack your things. You're fired." The entire restaurant erupted in whispers. The tyrant had fallen, and for the first time, the staff breathed freely. But Morgan wasn't done yet. He turned to the stunned employees, his expression softening. "From now on, things are going to be different." Samantha held her breath. The others waited. "And it starts with the new manager." Morgan's gaze landed on Samantha. She blinked, confused. "Me?" Morgan nodded. "You've endured the worst, and despite that, you showed up, worked hard, and kept going. That's the kind of leader this place needs." Samantha's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of hope. For the first time, she felt seen, valued. And Carl stormed out, his reign of terror finally over. Morgan had walked in as a customer, but now he was leaving as the man who had restored dignity to his own business. The restaurant had fallen into silence. Carl was gone, his reign of intimidation finally over. But the weight of his toxic leadership still lingered in the air. The employees, though relieved, stood motionless, as if they couldn't believe what had just happened. Had it really taken only one moment for everything to change? And then there was Samantha, the new manager. She stood at the center of it all, stunned, overwhelmed, and uncertain. Morgan could see the hesitation in her eyes. "Why me?" she whispered. Morgan smiled gently. "Because you understand what it means to be treated unfairly, and that means you'll never let it happen to someone else." She swallowed hard, tears glistening at the edge of her lashes. She had spent so long surviving. Now she had been given the chance to lead. But could she do it? Could she really step into this role? Not everyone in the restaurant welcomed the change immediately. Some employees exchanged uneasy glances. A few murmured under their breath, "She's just a waitress. Can she even manage a place like this? I bet she won't last a week." Morgan heard it all. And so did Samantha. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held her head high, because she knew that doubt and fear were part of the process. Morgan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to prove them wrong today," he said. "Just show up. Every day, be the kind of leader you never had." She nodded slowly, because for the first time, she believed she could. The next morning, Samantha arrived early. She stood in front of the mirror in the employee restroom, fixing her uniform, straightening her posture. This was it. Her first day as manager. She stepped out of the back room and instantly all eyes were on her. Some with curiosity, some with skepticism, and some with hope. But before she could even gather herself, a problem erupted. A customer at table 5 was complaining loudly. Samantha took a deep breath and walked over. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, sir. What can I do to make this right?" The man glared at her. "I ordered my steak medium rare. This is overcooked. What kind of restaurant are you running?" Samantha felt the pressure immediately. Before, she would have just apologized and let Carl handle it. But now it was on her. She had two choices: panic or lead. So she did what Morgan had taught her. She stayed calm. "I completely understand. Let me take this back and personally make sure you get exactly what you ordered." The customer huffed, but he nodded. Samantha turned, heading toward the kitchen. That was the moment everything shifted. Her team saw it. They saw how she handled pressure. They saw how she didn't let frustration break her. And for the first time, they believed in her. The day went on. Samantha worked harder than she ever had before. She helped servers clear tables. She assisted the kitchen staff when orders piled up. She listened to employees when they voiced concerns. And slowly, the tension began to fade. By the end of the shift, she was exhausted. But as she wiped the counter one last time, a voice spoke up behind her. "Hey, Sam!" She turned. It was one of the servers, Lisa. "You did good today." Samantha blinked. "I did?" Lisa nodded. "Yeah. And it feels different here, in a good way." A small, genuine smile formed on Samantha's lips, because she felt it too. Change had begun, and she was at the heart of it. Morgan sat in the corner, his coffee now cold. But he didn't care, because what he had witnessed was worth more than any business deal, any amount of money. He had seen a broken system heal. He had seen a woman rise when she once feared falling, and he had seen his employees find their voices again. This was his restaurant, and now it finally felt like home. Samantha had survived her first day as manager, but the real test, the real challenge, that was still ahead. Morgan Freeman had always believed that leadership was more than just authority. It was about lifting people up, not tearing them down. And as he watched his restaurant finally become the place he had always envisioned, he knew change had arrived. Not just in policies, not just in procedures, but in people. Samantha had stepped into a role she never expected. She had gone from being a worker afraid to speak up to a leader who inspired others. She had proved that leadership wasn't about experience, but about integrity. And Carl had lost his position, but something had changed in him too. He had spent years believing that fear was the best motivator. But now, as he looked back on the restaurant he had once controlled, he realized he had been wrong. Fear didn't build strong teams. Respect did. He never got his job back, but he did get something else, a chance to change. And for the first time, he took it. Months later, Freeman's fine dining thrived. Not just because the food was good, not just because the service had improved, but because now people wanted to be there. Employees showed up not out of fear, but out of pride. Customers could feel the difference. And at the center of it all, Samantha. No longer just a waitress trying to survive. Now, a leader creating a better future for everyone. Morgan watched it all unfold, sipping his coffee with a quiet smile. Because in the end, a true leader doesn't just change a business, they change lives. Respect isn't about power, it's about humanity. Through this story, we realize that leadership isn't about control, it's about responsibility. Morgan Freeman didn't just fire a bad manager, he empowered the right people to step up and lead. Samantha proved that the best leaders aren't always the loudest. They are the ones who listen, support, and lift others up. Carl learned the hard way that fear doesn't inspire. It only breaks people down. And in the end, a business is only as strong as the people who run it, because success isn't built by power. It's built by respect.